Imagine, if you will, a world where a small, secretive group of bankers, men who move unseen in the shadows, control not just the flow of money, but the very heartbeat of the global economy. They don't tell you this on the news, they don't teach you this in school, but everything you see, everything you've ever known about money, about finance, about wealth, it's a lie. This world is not what it seems. You've been told the Federal Reserve is a government entity, there to stabilize the economy, protect the people. But that is the story they want you to believe. The truth, it's far more sinister. A story of manipulation, secrecy, and power. You see, the Federal Reserve is not federal. It has no reserves, and it was never designed to serve the people. The Federal Reserve controls the money supply of the United States, but who controls the Federal Reserve? Who really makes the decisions, and more importantly, and what happens when those decisions are made in the dark? This is the story they don't want you to know. The story that begins with an island, a secret meeting, and the creation of the most powerful financial institution in the world. The year is 1910. America is a young nation emerging from the shadows of the 19th century, quickly transforming into an economic powerhouse. But beneath this facade of prosperity, something dark is brewing. A small group of men, some of the most powerful in the country, are about to meet in secret to change the course of history. They're not just any men. They are the titans of American finance, men who control industries, railroads, steel and oil. Men who understand that to control a nation, you must control its money. And that is exactly what they plan to do. On board this private train, heading toward a remote island off the coast of Georgia, are 7 men. They travel in secrecy, under fake names, avoiding direct contact with anyone. They know that if the public were to discover their plans, it could mean the end of their ambitions. This meeting, which will take place behind closed doors, will change the entire structure of the American economy, and with it, the world. Among them are Senator Nelson Aldrich, a towering figure in Washington representing the interests of Wall Street in Congress. Paul Warburg, a German-born banker who has studied the central banking systems of Europe and is eager to implement something similar in the US. J.P. Morgan's right-hand man, Henry Davison, a fierce defender of his banking empire. Charles Norton, the president of the First National Bank of New York, a financial institution so influential that it could bend governments to its will. Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank and one of the most powerful financiers in the world. Benjamin Strong, a banker with ties to both Wall Street and the newly formed Federal Reserve in New York. A. Piet Andrew, a Treasury official whose political ties help give legitimacy to the scheme. Together, these men control a quarter of the world's wealth. They are not just meeting to discuss policy, they are meeting to reshape the very system of money itself. Jekyll Island is the place they've chosen to meet in secrecy. It's a quiet, isolated retreat where they can avoid prying eyes. The only sound here is the rustling of the wind through the trees and the soft clink of glasses being filled with expensive brandy. The stage is set for a conspiracy that will forever alter the future of the United States. In those rooms, far from the reach of the public, these men begin to draft the legislation that will give birth to the Federal Reserve. They are not interested in serving the public. They are interested in control. They are about to create a central bank. But not just any central bank, a central bank that will answer to no one but themselves. Their plan is brilliant, insidious and dangerous. To create a central bank that has the power to print money, control interest rates and manipulate the economy without the oversight of the government or the public. A bank that will hold the power to decide who gets credit and who doesn't. A bank that can create economic booms and crashes. A bank that will enable them to enrich themselves while ordinary Americans are left at the mercy of the system. The creation of this bank will not be a democratic process. There will be no vote, no open debate, just a select group of men who will decide in secret what is best for the country and for themselves. And so, on that fateful meeting at Jekyll Island, the Federal Reserve System is born. A system that will be marketed as the solution to America's financial problems, a central bank that will stabilize the economy, smooth out the boom and bust cycles, and act as a safeguard against inflation and depression. But what if the truth is far darker than that? The Federal Reserve was not created for the people. It was created to serve the interests of a small elite group of bankers who knew that whoever controls the money supply controls everything. This is the beginning of a story of manipulation, power and wealth. The story of how the Federal Reserve came to control the US economy, and how it's still shaping the world today. Money. It's the lifeblood of the economy, right? It's what we use to pay for goods, to save for the future, to provide for our families. But here's the catch. Money doesn't come from the government. It doesn't come from you or me. No, the real power lies in a place you may never have considered, the Federal Reserve. You've been told the government prints money, haven't you? That's what we all assume, but that's a myth, a carefully cultivated lie. The truth, the Federal Reserve creates money, it's not the Treasury. And it doesn't do it through some old-fashioned printing press. No, it's far more sophisticated than that. They create money out of nothing, a process so simple, so invisible, that it's baffling to most people. But it all starts with debt. Here's how it works. The government needs money to function, whether for infrastructure projects, military spending or social programs. So they borrow money by issuing bonds. Think of them as IOUs from the government. They say, we'll pay you back with interest, and in return they get cash to fund their programs. But where does that cash come from? It doesn't come from tax revenue or the sale of assets. It comes from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve buys these bonds from the Treasury, but here's the key part. It doesn't use money it already has. No, the Federal Reserve creates the money out of thin air. They simply type the amount into a computer, creating brand new money that never existed before. That money is then transferred to the Treasury's account, ready to be spent. And just like that, new money enters the system, adding to the total money supply. This process is called monetary expansion, and it's done at the will of the Federal Reserve. When the Fed buys government bonds, they increase the money supply, which means more money is available to banks and businesses. But here's where things get truly dangerous. When the Federal Reserve creates money, it doesn't just hand it out to people like you and me. Instead, that money flows primarily into the hands of the big banks, corporations and government institutions. The public never sees most of it. It's a system that enriches the few while leaving the many struggling. For every dollar the Federal Reserve creates, banks are able to lend out 9 times that amount. This is because of something called fractional reserve banking. Banks are required to keep a fraction of the deposits they receive in reserve, hence the name. But the rest? They can lend it out at will, often at exorbitant interest rates. It's a cycle of debt that creates more debt, and the bigger the pile of debt, the more money the Federal Reserve is allowed to create to keep it all afloat. The result? Inflation. Inflation is the silent thief that erodes your wealth over time. As the Fed creates more money, it floods the economy with liquidity, making everything seem plentiful. But eventually, the value of the money in your wallet decreases, prices go up, your wages stay the same. The real winners in this system? The bankers. They get the money first before inflation kicks in. They get to buy assets and invest at prices that are still low, long before the rest of us feel the pinch. By the time the dollar's value starts to decline, they've already reaped their rewards. This is not a system built to serve the people. It's a system built to perpetuate the power of a select few. But what happens when this system reaches its limit? Every time the Federal Reserve pumps more money into the system, it creates a bubble, a false sense of prosperity. At first, the economy seems to boom. The stock market soars, consumer confidence rises, people borrow and spend, everyone feels rich like they're a part of something big. But then, the bubble bursts, the money supply is restricted, interest rates are raised, the easy credit dries up and the economy collapses. The Great Depression, the 2008 financial crisis. The pattern is always the same. And behind it all, the Federal Reserve is there, making decisions that affect billions. Yet they are accountable to no one. And as the cycle continues, the wealth of the few grows exponentially while the majority is left in the dust, forced to pick up the pieces. The rich get richer, the poor stay poor. This is the power of the Federal Reserve. It's a system built on secrecy, lies, and manipulation. And it's time we understood exactly how it works, so we can begin to see through the smoke and mirrors, because as long as the Federal Reserve controls the money supply, it controls everything. Imagine a world where the economy is a delicate balancing act, constantly teetering between boom and bust, where the growth you see around you, the jobs, the investments, the rising markets, are all carefully orchestrated by an invisible hand. And that hand? It belongs to the Federal Reserve. For decades, the Federal Reserve has held the power to create boom and bust cycles, shaping the economy by manipulating the flow of money. But these cycles are far from natural. They don't just happen on their own. No, they are engineered, planned, manipulated. You see, the economy doesn't just crash because things go wrong or market forces take over. The truth is darker. The Federal Reserve plays a central role in making these crises happen, and more importantly, in ensuring that the rich come out on top while the rest of us pick up the pieces. The year was 1929. The US economy was booming. The stock market was at an all-time high, and everyone, from Wall Street tycoons to ordinary Americans, was buying in. Everyone thought they were getting rich. But what most people didn't realize was that this boom had been artificially created by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve had been expanding the money supply by lowering interest rates and flooding the economy with cheap credit. Banks were lending out money like it was endless. Everyone was borrowing to invest in the stock market, and stock prices soared, regardless of whether those stocks were actually worth anything. It was a classic bubble. And the Federal Reserve, they knew exactly what they were doing. In the summer of 1929, the Federal Reserve began to tighten its grip. Interest rates were raised and the flow of credit started to slow down. The party was over. Stock prices began to fall and suddenly the market collapsed. The Great Depression had begun. Unemployment skyrocketed, banks failed, and millions of Americans lost their homes and savings. But here's the kicker. While ordinary people suffered, the big banks, the ones with the closest ties to the Federal Reserve, were bailed out, cushioned from the economic fallout. They had weathered the storm, and when the dust settled, they were richer than ever. Fast forward to 2008. The same cycle repeated itself. Another bubble was inflating. This time, it was the housing market. The Federal Reserve once again kept interest rates low and flooded the market with easy money. Banks started giving out subprime loans to people who couldn't afford them. Everyone was buying homes thinking the market would never crash. But what happened next? The Federal Reserve began to raise interest rates again. The easy credit disappeared, the bubble popped, and the entire financial system collapsed. The 2008 financial crisis led to millions losing their homes. Banks collapsed, the stock market plummeted. The global economy teetered on the edge of disaster. But the Federal Reserve, it bailed out the banks again. With trillions in taxpayer money, they saved the very institutions that had caused the collapse. So why does this keep happening? It's because the Federal Reserve isn't about keeping the economy stable for everyone. It's about protecting the wealth and power of the financial elite. When the economy is in trouble, the Fed steps in, it creates more money, it bails out the banks, it ensures that the richest Americans don't lose a dime, but for the rest of us, we're left with the wreckage. The boom and bust cycle is their game, and we're just the pawns. This manipulation isn't just about economic fluctuations, it's a deliberate tool, a tool to redistribute wealth from the middle class to the ultra-wealthy, because every time the system crashes, the wealthiest individuals and corporations buy up distressed assets for pennies on the dollar. They become stronger, they become richer, and the cycle starts all over again. But what happens when the system finally breaks down entirely? When the bubble bursts and there's nothing left to inflate it? That, my friends, is the question the Federal Reserve doesn't want you to ask. The Federal Reserve's reach extends far beyond the borders of the United States. Its power isn't confined to Wall Street or the banks in New York City. It stretches across the globe, and it influences the lives of billions of people, from Beijing to Berlin to Rio de Janeiro. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency, an economic reality that gives the Federal Reserve unparalleled influence over global finance. It's the foundation of international trade, it's the benchmark for global investments, and it's all controlled by a group of bankers in a room in Washington, D.C., a room no one gets to see. The global financial system revolves around the dollar. It's the currency used in almost every international transaction, from oil deals in the Middle East to trade agreements in Asia. For decades, countries around the world have had no choice but to hold large amounts of dollars in their reserves, just to keep their economies running smoothly. This gives the Federal Reserve tremendous leverage. But here's where things get interesting, and a little more troubling. Nations like China, Russia and Saudi Arabia, three of the world's largest economies, are increasingly pushing for alternatives to the dollar. They know that the Fed's ability to print endless amounts of money doesn't just affect the US economy. It has a domino effect that ripples through the entire world. When the Federal Reserve prints more money, it causes inflation, not just in the United States, but globally. The value of the dollar declines, making everything more expensive. This includes oil, food and raw materials, the essentials that fuel the global economy. Countries that rely on the dollar for trade start feeling the effects of US inflation, even if their own economies are otherwise stable. It's the hidden tax of the dollar system, a tax that's paid not just by Americans but by billions of people around the world. In response, nations like China have begun to take action. They've started to diversify their reserves, moving away from the dollar and into gold, other currencies, and even digital assets. China has even launched its own digital currency, the digital yuan, as part of its strategy to break free from US economic control. And it's not just China. Russia, Iran, and even some European countries have made moves to reduce their dependency on the dollar. But what happens if the rest of the world decides to stop using the dollar altogether? What happens if they stop accepting dollars for oil, for trade, for everything? The implications of this shift would be catastrophic. Without the dollar as the world's reserve currency, the Federal Reserve loses its ability to dictate global economic conditions. The United States could face massive inflation and a decline in living standards, as foreign nations would no longer need to hold US dollars in their reserves. Imagine the value of the dollar plummeting. The prices of everyday goods, gas, food, even housing, skyrocket. The US economy would spiral out of control. For the first time in modern history, the US could lose its economic dominance. And the Federal Reserve, they'd have to scramble. Unable to control the global system the way they have for over a century, the Fed might resort to even more extreme measures, more money printing, higher interest rates and increased government intervention in markets. But these solutions could lead to even more chaos and destabilization. What's coming next is bigger than anything we've seen before. And the Federal Reserve is preparing for it. Because there's one last piece of the puzzle, the cashless society. The Fed has been pushing for a digital dollar for years now, and it's only a matter of time before it becomes a reality. This new digital currency would allow the Federal Reserve to have total control over every transaction, every purchase, every movement of money. There would be no more paper bills or coins. Everything would be recorded in a digital ledger, and every dollar you spend would be tracked. It's the final step in the centralization of power. No longer would the Federal Reserve just control the money supply. It would control every aspect of the financial system. For the average person, this might seem like a convenience. You might be able to make transactions faster without needing cash. But for the elite and the banks, it's a dream come true. They'll be able to monitor your spending habits, freeze your accounts at a moment's notice, and force you to comply with their rules, no questions asked. And with the digital dollar, there's no escaping the system. Every single cent of wealth you own could be controlled by a central authority. And if you ever step out of line, well, the government or the Federal Reserve could simply turn off your access to money. The Federal Reserve isn't just manipulating the US economy, it's playing a much bigger game. And as the world watches, the stakes are rising. Will the dollar continue to reign supreme? Or is the global financial system about to undergo a radical shift? One thing is certain. The Federal Reserve's influence is not just economic, it's geopolitical, and it could shape the future of the world. The Federal Reserve is pushing the world towards a cashless society. It may seem efficient, no more paper bills, no more coins, but it comes with a hidden cost. In a world of digital currency, every dollar you spend will be tracked. This is the future total financial control. The government can freeze your assets, penalize you for certain purchases, or monitor your spending habits. Privacy is gone, and freedom becomes just a memory. The digital dollar, the final control mechanism. The digital dollar is the ultimate tool for the Fed to assert dominance. Unlike cash, it's easy to manipulate. With every transaction recorded, the government would have the power to monitor, restrict, and punish based on your spending choices. For the elite, this means control over not just your money, but your life. The endgame centralized control. The Federal Reserve isn't just seeking control over the US economy, they want the global financial system under their thumb. The cashless society is their ticket to that power. With the digital dollar, they can exert total control over your finances and with it, your freedom. If this video opened your eyes, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. The future of our financial freedom depends on what we do next.